Hey buddy, welcome back. Before you get comfortable, I want you to picture something. It's London and it's 1875 and somewhere on a quiet street, a woman has just died in an upstairs bedroom. Within the hour, before the doctor has even finished writing out his certificate, someone in that house is doing something you would never think to do. They are walking from room to room, stopping every clock in the house one by one until the whole home falls silent except for the wind against the windows. Nobody in that house thinks this is strange. It is simply what you do. If a clock keeps ticking after a death, the Victorians believed it might tick the next member of the family straight into the grave behind her. So the clocks stop. And so do the mirrors get covered one by one with black cloth or a folded sheet, because a mirror left uncovered might catch the soul of the dead on its way out and trap it there, wandering the glass forever. That's where we're going tonight. Get comfortable, pull the blanket up. Let your eyes get heavy, because tonight isn't about ghosts or horror. It's about something quieter and, in its own way, stranger. It's about how an entire era of ordinary people who built railways and split the atom of the modern world open, still lived every single day of their lives wrapped in a soft, constant fog of superstition. Not because they were foolish, because they were human in a world that was changing faster than any world had ever changed before, and the strange old beliefs were the only handrail they had. So settle in. Let's go inside. If this is your first time here, welcome to the quiet past. This is the place where we don't chase you with jump cuts or shouting or breaking news chimes. We just sit together in the dark like people used to sit by a hearth, and we let history come to us slowly in its own good time. If that sounds like your kind of evening, I'd love it if you tapped that subscribe button quietly without waking anyone else in the house. It costs nothing and it means a lot, and it helps this little corner of the internet keep the fire going. Now, no more housekeeping. Let's get back to 1875 and to the clocks and to everything else the Victorians were so certain of. I want you to imagine for a moment what it actually felt like to live inside the 19th century. Not the version in the museum with the velvet rope and the polished brass. The real version, cold floors in the morning, coal smoke thick enough to taste. Streets lit, if you were lucky, by gas lamps that hissed and flickered, and if you weren't, by nothing at all, so that the dark past your own front step was genuinely, completely dark, the kind of dark most of us have never experienced. Illness that arrived without explanation and left without warning. Death that visited nearly every family, and often more than once, and often among the very young. Now hold that feeling for a second. Hold the cold and the dark and the uncertainty of it. Because that is the soil superstition grew in. It wasn't ignorance exactly, though we'll get to some genuinely wild examples of that tonight. It was something closer to a coping mechanism, stitched together out of old folk memory, half-understood science, church teaching that hadn't quite let go of older pagan roots, and a very human need to feel like you had some small say over a world that mostly did not care what happened to you. The Victorians, if you asked them directly, were the most rational people who had ever lived. They believed in progress. They believed in steam and telegraphs and the periodic table and germ theory, eventually. And at the very same time, in the very same houses, sometimes in the very same breath, they believed you could kill a man by giving him the evil eye, that a robin tapping on your window pane meant a death was coming, that placing your shoes in the shape of a T at the foot of your bed would ward off nightmares, and that a loaf of bread that split down the middle while baking meant a funeral was on its way. Tonight we're going to walk through their world room by room, season by season, and belief by belief. We'll start where every proper ghost story starts, with death itself, and the strange, tender, almost obsessive rituals the Victorians built up around it. Then we'll move into the home, the kitchen, the garden, the nursery, the wedding day, and even the séance parlor, because by the end of the century, half of fashionable London was trying to talk to the dead over tea. Along the way, I want you to notice something. Notice how much of this superstition wasn't really about magic at all. It was about love and grief and the desperate wish to protect the people you cared about in a world that gave you almost no other tools to do it with. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow down. We have a long, quiet night ahead of us and nowhere else to be. Let's go inside. The House of the Dead. I want you to imagine a terraced house on an ordinary street in an ordinary English town sometime in the 1860s. It is early morning, the light still gray and thin, and inside that house someone has just died in the night. Maybe it was an elderly grandmother, worn down slowly by age. Maybe, and this happened far more often than we like to remember, it was a child, taken quickly by a fever that no one quite understood and no one could stop. Whatever the cause, the moment the last breath leaves the body, a whole quiet machinery of ritual begins to turn, almost without anyone needing to be told. Someone goes to the mantel clock and stops the pendulum, noting the exact time on a slip of paper, because that is the moment that will go on the death certificate, and also because, as I mentioned, a clock left running in a house of death was thought to tick another family member toward their own end. Someone else moves through the house, covering every mirror they can find in the parlor, in the hall, in the bedroom itself, with black crepe or plain cloth or whatever comes to hand, because an uncovered mirror might reflect the departing soul and snare it, keeping it from moving on to wherever it was meant to go. Now I want you to sit with that idea for just a moment, because I think it tells us something true and rather touching about the Victorians. They did not think of death as something clean, something that simply ended and was finished. They thought of it as a passage, a doorway the soul had to travel through, and like any doorway in an old house, it could be blocked or the wrong thing could slip through it if you weren't careful. Covering the mirrors wasn't cruelty or nonsense to them. It was a kind of gentle traffic control for the soul of someone they loved. The rituals didn't stop there. In many households, especially in the countryside, the body itself would be turned so the feet faced the door, ready, symbolically, for the journey ahead. Windows might be opened, just a crack, even in the depths of winter, to let the spirit leave freely rather than feel trapped in the room where it died. And in some regions, particularly in Wales and parts of the north of England, there was a custom of placing a small dish of salt on the chest of the deceased, sometimes with a piece of bread beside it, an old practice tied to something called sin eating, where a person, often desperately poor, would be paid a few pennies to eat the bread and take on the sins of the dead so the departed soul could pass on unburdened. By the High Victorian period, this had mostly faded into folk memory, told as a story about what the old people used to do. but you can still find written accounts from the 1850s and 1860s of sin-eaters being summoned to remote farmhouses. Quiet men who walked from village to village doing this one strange, sad job, eating on behalf of the dead so the living could sleep easier. Let's slow down here and imagine one of these houses in full mourning. The blinds are drawn and stay drawn, sometimes for weeks. A black wreath, or in poorer households simply a length of black ribbon, hangs on the front door, a signal to every neighbor and tradesman who passes that this house is currently a house of grief and should be approached quietly if approached at all. Inside, the air smells of beeswax candles and coal smoke, and underneath that faintly of the herbs and spices used to help preserve the body in the days before it could be properly laid out and eventually buried. Because here is something we forget. In an ordinary Victorian household, the body did not go straight to a funeral parlor. There were no funeral parlors as we would recognize them, not for most of the century. The body stayed in the house, often in the front parlor, for anywhere from 2 to 5 days, sometimes longer for someone of importance, while family and friends came to pay their respects, and while the necessary arrangements, coffin, plot, mourning clothes, were slowly put together. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine sharing your home, your ordinary daily life, cooking, eating, putting the younger children to bed, with the body of someone you loved lying in the next room, candles burning steadily at the head and foot of the coffin day and night, because an unlit corpse in the old belief was vulnerable, unprotected, left in the dark exactly when it needed light the most. This is also where photography enters our story, and I promise you, if you don't already know this particular Victorian habit, it will stay with you a long while. In the middle of the century, photography was still new, still expensive, and still, for most ordinary families, something you might only ever do once in your life. And so, when a child died, which happened with heartbreaking frequency in an age before vaccines and antibiotics, many families chose to have their one and only photograph taken of that child after death. These are called memorial photographs, sometimes post-mortem photographs, and if you have ever come across one online and felt a chill, you are not alone. The child is often dressed in their best clothes, propped gently in a chair or laid in a small bed, sometimes with eyes closed in peaceful sleep sometimes, and this is the detail that unsettles people most today, with eyes carefully painted open afterward on the photographic plate, or propped open with small supports during the sitting itself, so that in the final image the child appears simply to be looking calmly at the camera, alive in every way except the one that mattered. We look at these photographs now and feel a kind of horror, but I want you to try, just for a moment, to see it through Victorian eyes instead. For many of these families, this was not a morbid choice. It was often the only image they would ever have of a child they loved desperately, a way of holding onto a face that would otherwise fade entirely from memory within a generation. Grief in the Victorian world was not something you were expected to hide away and process quietly and privately, the way we are so often taught today. Grief was public and visible and worn, quite literally, on your body for the whole world to see. Which brings us to mourning dress, one of the most elaborate systems of social signaling the modern world has ever produced. As if you were a widow in the Victorian era, you were expected to wear deep, unrelieved black, no jewelry, no jet, no shine of any kind, no lace even, for a full year following your husband's death. This period was called full mourning. After that first year came half mourning, where small amounts of gray, lavender, or deep purple could gradually creep back into the wardrobe, and jet jewelry, that dense, matte black gemstone mined largely from the cliffs around Whitby, could finally be worn, but still nothing bright, nothing joyful, nothing that suggested the world had simply moved on. For men, the expectations were considerably lighter, which tells you something all on its own about Victorian gender roles. A black armband, a black hatband, perhaps a black tie, and life could largely resume as normal within weeks. But for women, mourning could stretch on for a year, 2 years, sometimes, in the case of Queen Victoria herself, for the rest of a very long life. And that is really where this whole culture of mourning finds its center, because the Queen herself, after the death of her husband Prince Albert in 1861, wore black for the remaining 40 years of her own life. She withdrew from public view so completely, and for so long, that the newspapers of the time openly worried about whether the monarchy itself could survive her grief. An entire nation, in a strange way, took its emotional cues from a woman locked in a private, unending mourning of her own, and the fashions, the etiquette, the entire elaborate machinery of Victorian death culture grew up in the long shadow of her example. Let's step back out of that house for a moment, back into the gray morning light, and let the cold air clear our heads a little. Because what I find most striking about all of this, the stopped clocks, the covered mirrors, the photographs of sleeping children who were not really asleep, is how much of it comes from the same simple human place. These were not people who did not understand death. They understood it far more intimately than most of us do today, because it visited their homes so much more often and so much more visibly. What they were doing with all these small strange rituals was trying to make death mean something, trying to give it shape and order and a kind of dignity, in a world where it could otherwise strike suddenly and take away a person you loved with no warning at all. Now let's leave the house of mourning behind just for a while and step into a warmer room. Let's go into the kitchen, where the fire is lit and the bread is rising, and an entirely different, quieter set of beliefs was busy shaping the ordinary rhythm of the Victorian day. The kitchen and the hearth. I want you to imagine stepping into a Victorian kitchen on a cold autumn morning. The cast iron range is already lit, ticking and creaking as it heats, and the whole room smells faintly of coal smoke and yeast, and the particular mineral smell of well-scrubbed stone floors. A servant, or in a poorer household simply the woman of the house herself, is standing at the wooden table, working dough between her hands, and if you watch her closely, you'll notice she does something small and specific before she puts the loaf in to bake. She cuts across into the top of it with the edge of a knife, quick and almost unconscious, the way you or I might glance at a clock. Ask her why, and she might not even have a full answer ready beyond, "That's just what you do." But if you press her, the old belief underneath that simple gesture goes back centuries, tangled up with old ideas about keeping the devil out of the bread, about letting evil spirits escape the rising dough rather than becoming trapped inside it, and later with a simpler Christian meaning layered comfortably on top, the cross as a small blessing on the household's daily bread. By the Victorian period, most people cutting that cross were doing it simply because their mother did it, and her mother before that, a little unbroken chain of habit stretching back further than anyone standing in that kitchen could actually say. And bread, in the Victorian world, was watched closely, almost anxiously, for omens. If a loaf split open unevenly on one side while baking, that was said to foretell a death in the family, a small domestic echo of the same anxious relationship with mortality we just spent so long sitting inside. If the bread failed to rise at all, that could be blamed on any number of things. A jealous neighbor with an evil eye, an unlucky day of the week for baking, 13 at the table the night before, or simply, and here is where you can feel the superstition and the plain domestic reality blur together. A servant girl who was, as they said, unlucky with her hands, which might really just mean she had gotten the proportions wrong. The salt occupied an enormous, almost sacred place in the Victorian kitchen, and in Victorian belief generally, a holdover from a much older world where salt was rare, expensive, and essential for preserving food through the winter. Spilling salt was considered deeply unlucky, and the correction for it had a very specific choreography. You were meant to take a pinch of the spilled salt with your right hand and throw it back over your left shoulder. Directly, the belief went into the face of the devil, who was thought to be lurking there specifically to take advantage of any small domestic misfortune. Walk into any respectable Victorian dining room during a meal, and if someone knocked over the salt cellar, you would very likely see this little ritual performed instantly, almost as reflex, by people who otherwise considered themselves entirely modern and rational. Let's imagine that dinner table for a moment, because it is such a wonderfully specific window into how these people actually lived. The number 13 was to be avoided at all costs when seating guests, tracing back to the old story of the Last Supper and Judas as the 13th guest at that fateful table. If a hostess found herself with 13 confirmed guests and no way to add a 14th at short notice, it was not unheard of for a footman or even a large doll to be seated at the table simply to break up the unlucky number. Crossed knives on the table were considered a bad sign, thought to invite arguments or even violence among the diners, and would be quickly uncrossed by any servant who noticed them before the family sat down. And if you dropped a knife while eating, tradition held that a male visitor would soon call at the house. Drop a fork and it would be a female visitor instead. Drop a spoon and you could expect a child or a fool, depending on which corner of the country you happened to be in. I want you to imagine the tea table too, because tea, by the mid-Victorian period, had become something close to a national ritual in itself, and it came absolutely wrapped in its own superstitions. Bubbles floating on the surface of a freshly poured cup of tea were said to mean money was coming your way, and the eager among the household might quickly try to scoop them onto a spoon and swallow them before they popped, to seal in the good fortune. The 2 spoons accidentally placed in one saucer meant a double wedding somewhere in the near future, And if the lid was accidentally left off the teapot, that, rather ominously, was taken as a sign that a stranger would soon arrive at the house, hungry and expecting to be fed. Then there was the fine art of reading tea leaves themselves, a practice called tasseography, which had drifted into English parlors from continental Europe and taken on a distinctly cozy, domestic English flavor by the time it settled into Victorian kitchens. Once a cup of tea, made properly with loose leaves rather than the tea bags we use today, was finished, the drinker would turn the cup upside down onto the saucer, give it 3 careful turns, and then turn it back over to examine the pattern the wet leaves had settled into along the inside of the cup. A shape near the rim meant something close at hand, something likely to happen soon. A shape near the bottom of the cup meant something further off, months or even years away. Whole small dictionaries were published and sold cheaply, telling you that a shape like an anchor meant success in business, a shape like a snake meant an enemy nearby, a shape like a bird meant good news arriving by letter. It became, especially among women, a gentle, sociable little ritual, something to do together over the last dregs of the afternoon tea, half game, half genuine belief, not entirely unlike how many of us today might read a horoscope in the morning paper, enjoying it, half believing it, not making any real decisions based on it, but not quite willing to dismiss it outright either. Now let's step outside the kitchen door for a moment, out into the small back garden that most ordinary Victorian houses had, even modest terraced houses in the growing industrial towns, and let's look at what was happening with the plants and the animals and the wider natural world just beyond the kitchen window. Omens in the garden and sky. Imagine standing at the back door of a Victorian house in early spring, a light, cold rain falling, the smell of wet soil rising up from the small vegetable garden most families kept, even in the cities, tucked in behind rows of terraced houses. Somewhere on the fence, a single magpie is perched, watching you with that particular sideways, intelligent tilt of the head magpies have always had. If you had lived in Victorian England, that single magpie would very likely have made you uneasy. There was an old rhyme, one that children learned almost as soon as they learned to count, that went 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, and it continued on through the numbers, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. A lone magpie meant sorrow was coming, and so you would see grown adults, perfectly sensible in every other part of their lives, performing a small private ritual right there in the garden, tipping their hat to the bird or saluting it or muttering a quiet greeting like, "Good morning, Mr. Magpie, how is your wife today?" specifically to counteract the bad luck of having seen only one. It sounds almost comic written down like that, and in a way it was, a little private joke everyone was in on, but it was also taken seriously enough that people genuinely performed it, day after day, all across the country. Birds in general carried enormous symbolic weight in the Victorian imagination. A robin tapping persistently at a window pane was widely believed to foretell a death in the household. A belief so widespread and so deeply felt that in some regions, people would actually try to shoo the bird away gently rather than let it keep tapping, as though the tapping itself, rather than whatever misfortune it supposedly predicted, was the thing to be avoided. A bird that somehow found its way inside the house, flying in through an open window or down a chimney, was considered a very serious omen indeed, again usually connected to death, and there are written accounts from the period of entire households falling into genuine anxiety for days after a sparrow or a swallow got trapped inside a parlor and had to be carefully caught and released. Owls, with their eerie, disembodied calls carrying across the dark countryside at night, were almost universally associated with death and misfortune, an old belief stretching back through the medieval period and further still into pre-Christian folklore, one the Victorians inherited largely intact and never quite let go of, even as they built railways and gaslit their cities. Let's imagine for a moment a Victorian farmer or countryman walking home at dusk, along a hedge-lined lane, the light fading fast, the air turning cold and damp the way it does in the English countryside just as the sun goes down. He hears an owl call from somewhere in the dark trees ahead, and I want you to imagine the small, involuntary tightening in his chest, even though he might tell you, if you asked him directly the next morning in the warm light of day, that of course he doesn't really believe such things. And yet in that moment, in the near dark, with the cold pressing in and the owl calling again from somewhere unseen, the old belief rises up anyway, because that is how superstition actually works. It doesn't live in the daylight, rational part of the mind. It lives in the part of us that is still, underneath all our progress, a little bit afraid of the dark. Weather itself was read constantly for signs, in a world with no forecasts, no satellites, nothing but pattern and memory and old rhymes passed down through generations of farmers and sailors who depended, quite literally, on being able to guess correctly what tomorrow would bring. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight, red sky in morning, shepherd's warning was more than just a pretty rhyme. It reflected a genuine, reasonably reliable bit of folk meteorology about how light scatters through different types of atmospheric moisture. Something the Victorians had worked out through centuries of careful observation, long before anyone understood the actual physics behind it. The halos around the moon were thought to predict rain within a day or two, another piece of folk wisdom that happens to have a real basis in how ice crystals in high, thin clouds bend moonlight, clouds that often do precede a change in the weather. Let's take a slow breath here and think about how strange and how sensible this all really was, tangled together in a single, seamless way of understanding the world. Because that's really the heart of what we're exploring tonight. The Victorians did not experience these beliefs as separate from their scientific modern selves. A farmer reading the sky for tomorrow's weather and a scientist in a London laboratory studying the properties of gases were in a sense doing versions of the very same thing, trying to find pattern and predictability in a world that otherwise felt unpredictable and at times frightening. Now let's turn from the wide open sky back towards something much more intimate. Let's go inside again, into the private, quiet moments of courtship and marriage, where an entirely different, gentler, and in some ways more hopeful set of Victorian superstitions took hold. Love, courtship, and the wedding day. I want you to imagine a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, sitting alone in her bedroom on the night before her wedding. The candle on her nightstand has burned low, and the house around her has gone quiet, everyone else already asleep. She is not thinking about lace or flowers or any of the practical details of tomorrow. She is thinking about a piece of wedding cake, wrapped carefully in a small square of paper which she is about to slide under her pillow. This was one of the sweetest and most widespread of all Victorian courtship superstitions. A young unmarried woman who slept with a piece of wedding cake under her pillow was said to dream that night of the man she would eventually marry. At larger, more elaborate weddings, small individual portions of cake, sometimes even passed through a specially made wedding ring for extra luck, were prepared specifically for this purpose, and handed out to the unmarried women among the guests almost as party favors, a little piece of hopeful magic to carry home with them. Dreams themselves were taken extremely seriously as a source of insight in the Victorian world, and entire published dream dictionaries did brisk business throughout the century, promising to translate the strange images of the sleeping mind into clear predictions about waking life. To dream of clear water suggested happiness and good fortune ahead. To dream of muddy or turbulent water suggested trouble on the horizon. To dream of losing a tooth, a dream image that still unsettles people today, was widely read as an omen of death, either your own or that of someone close to you. An anxiety so persistent that you can find it echoed in dream interpretation guides all the way back through the medieval period and forward into folk belief that survives, in fragments even now. The wedding day itself, once it finally arrived, was an absolute minefield of careful superstition, each element chosen and arranged with real deliberation. The groom was absolutely forbidden from seeing the bride in her wedding dress before the ceremony itself, a superstition we still, whether we quite believe it or not, hold on to even today. The reasoning in the Victorian mind was fairly direct. Bad luck, quite serious bad luck, would follow the couple if this rule was broken, potentially souring the entire marriage before it had even properly begun. The bride's dress carried its own layer of meaning, most famously in the old rhyme something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, which had crystallized into something close to its modern form by the Victorian period. Something old represented the connection to the bride's own family and her past. Something new represented optimism for the new life and new family she was about to join. Something borrowed, often a piece of jewelry lent by a happily married relative, was meant to carry a little of that relative's own good fortune in marriage forward into the new union. And something blue, tracing back to old associations between the color blue and purity, fidelity, and love, was there to protect the marriage against the evil eye and any lingering bad luck. Many brides also tucked a small silver sixpence into their left shoe, a charm meant specifically to guarantee financial prosperity for the couple in the years ahead, and this particular custom was so widespread and so beloved that it survived, largely unchanged, well into the 20th century, and echoes of it can still be found in weddings today. The choice of wedding day itself mattered enormously, and Victorian couples consulted old rhymes about which day of the week was luckiest for a marriage, with Wednesday generally considered the best possible choice. Monday for wealth, Tuesday for health, Wednesday the best day of all, the old rhyme went, while Saturday, oddly enough given how popular it is for weddings today, was considered distinctly unlucky. Saturday no luck at all. May itself was widely avoided as a wedding month altogether, a superstition stretching back to Roman times and the old festival of Lemuria, held in May to appease restless and potentially malevolent spirits, a memory so old that most Victorians who avoided May weddings had no idea why they were doing it, only that their mothers had told them never to marry in May, and that was reason enough. Rain on the wedding day was interpreted differently depending on which part of the country you happened to be in, sometimes read as a blessing, tears of joy falling from heaven upon the happy couple, and sometimes in other regions read as a genuinely troubling omen for the marriage ahead. And the order in which the wedding party walked down the aisle was carefully arranged not just for visual effect but for luck as well, with the bride traditionally walking on the left side of her father, positioning her, according to old belief, protectively on the side closer to his heart. Let's slow down here for a moment and just sit quietly with all of this. Every single one of these small rituals, the cake beneath the pillow, the sixpence in the shoe, the careful choice of Wednesday over Saturday, was really an attempt to do something that is, in the end, impossible. It was an attempt to guarantee happiness in advance, to somehow lock in a good outcome for a decision marriage that the Victorians understood, perhaps even more clearly than we do today, carried enormous and permanent risk. There was no easy divorce in this world. There was, for women especially, very little legal protection if a marriage turned unhappy or even abusive. So is it really any wonder that they reached for every small charm available to them, hoping that anything might help tip the scales toward a happy life together? Now from the wedding day, let's follow the natural next step in a Victorian life into the nursery, and into the extraordinary, anxious, deeply tender world of superstitions surrounding pregnancy, birth, and small children. The nursery and the newborn child. I want you to imagine a Victorian bedroom, softly lit by a single oil lamp turned down low, the fire in the small grate banked for the night, giving off just enough warmth to keep the chill of the room at bay. A woman lies in bed, exhausted, having given birth only hours before, and in a small wooden cradle beside her, wrapped tightly in blankets, lies a newborn child. This room, more than almost any other in the Victorian house, was thick with careful, anxious ritual, and for reasons that become immediately understandable the moment you look at the numbers. In the mid-Victorian period, infant mortality rates in Britain's growing industrial cities could run as high as 1 in 5 children dying before their first birthday, and in the poorest, most crowded urban districts, sometimes considerably higher than that. Sit with that figure for a moment. 1 in 5. Imagine looking down at your own newborn child, knowing, whether you spoke it aloud or not, that these were the odds you were facing. Is it really any surprise that people reached again and again for every small protective charm and ritual available to them? New mothers were traditionally kept confined to their beds and their bedrooms for a period of time after giving birth, often 2 full weeks or more, a practice called lying in. This served a genuine practical purpose, allowing the body real time to recover from the enormous physical trauma of childbirth in an age with no reliable pain relief and a very real risk of infection. But it also carried a layer of older superstitious meaning. The idea that a new mother was in some sense still vulnerable, still partly caught between 2 states, not fully returned to ordinary life, and needed to be protected accordingly, kept indoors, kept warm, kept away from the evil eye and the general dangers of the outside world, until she and the child were both considered strong enough to properly rejoin it. The christening, when it finally came, usually within the first few weeks of life, was absolutely thick with careful superstition, each detail considered and arranged with real deliberation. It was widely believed that a baby should cry during the baptism itself, since a cry was thought to represent the devil leaving the child's body as the holy water touched it. A silent baby, one who slept peacefully through the entire ceremony, could actually cause some quiet concern among older, more traditional relatives in attendance who might worry that the devil had somehow been allowed to remain. The christening gown itself was very often a family heirloom, passed down carefully through generations, worn by every child in the family in turn, and considered to carry forward good luck and blessing from every child who had worn it safely before. The godparents were chosen with genuine care, and it was considered important that they be present and standing at the front, close to the child, during the ceremony itself, both for the obvious spiritual reasons and because of an old belief that the godparents' own good character and good fortune would somehow rub off in a very literal sense onto the child they were sponsoring. There were countless smaller domestic charms too, gentler and quieter than the formal church ceremony, but taken just as seriously in the day-to-day life of the household. A silver coin, often that same sixpence we saw tucked into the wedding shoe, might be placed in the baby's cradle for luck and future prosperity. Red items, ribbons, small pieces of coral were considered protective against the evil eye, and it was extremely common to see a small piece of red coral, sometimes carved into a tiny handle for the baby to hold, hung above a Victorian cradle. Iron, in the form of a small nail or a horseshoe fragment, might be tucked discreetly under the mattress or hidden somewhere in the cradle itself, since iron was widely believed across British folklore to ward off malevolent fairies who were thought to have a particular dangerous interest in newborn children. And this brings us to one of the most genuinely unsettling corners of Victorian folk belief, the idea of the changeling. In older, more rural parts of the country, particularly in Ireland, Wales, and remote parts of England and Scotland, there survived a persistent old belief that fairies might steal away a healthy human infant in the night and leave one of their own sickly fairy children in its place. A changeling who would then fail to thrive, cry constantly, or develop in some way differently from other children. This belief, chilling as it sounds to us now, tragically sometimes attached itself to real children who were suffering from what we would today recognize as developmental disabilities, illnesses, or conditions entirely unrelated to any fairy interference at all. And there are documented, deeply sad cases from the era of families attempting various folk remedies, and in the very worst instances, genuine cruelty in a desperate, misguided attempt to drive the supposed changeling out and recover their real child. I raise this not to dwell on it, because it is a genuinely dark thread in an otherwise mostly gentle tapestry of belief, but because it reminds us of something important as we sit here together tonight. Superstition was not always harmless or charming. Sometimes it grew out of real fear and real grief, and sometimes, in its worst moments, it caused real harm. Most of what we're exploring tonight is gentle, even sweet, small acts of hope and protection. But it's worth remembering every so often that the same impulse that leads someone to tuck a piece of coral into a cradle for luck could also, in its darker moments, lead somewhere much sadder. Let's take a breath here and let the weight of that settle gently without dwelling on it too long. Let's return instead to warmer, gentler ground, back toward the small everyday charms of luck and misfortune that ordinary Victorians carried with them through their daily lives, quite apart from birth or death or marriage. Everyday luck signs and small protections. I want you to imagine an ordinary Victorian morning in an ordinary house, and a woman getting ready to leave for the day, perhaps to visit a friend or to run errands in town. She reaches for her boots by the door and pauses just for a half-second, checking that she has put the right boot on before the left. This mattered. Putting on the left shoe before the right was widely considered to invite bad luck for the entire day ahead. A small, almost automatic habit so deeply ingrained that most people performing it likely could not have told you exactly where the belief came from, only that their mother had always been careful about it, and so they were careful about it too. Stepping outside, she walks down the street, and if her path happens to take her past a ladder leaning against a wall, she steps carefully around it rather than underneath, a superstition still very much alive today, and one that in the Victorian period carried genuine, layered meaning. A ladder leaning against a wall forms a natural triangle with the ground, and that triangular shape was associated, through old Christian symbolism, with the Holy Trinity, meaning that to walk through it was considered a kind of small blasphemy. There was also a more practical, grim association, since ladders were closely connected in the public imagination with gallows and executions, and walking beneath one was thought to bring you symbolically closer to that same unlucky fate. If a black cat crossed her path, the meaning depended entirely, and rather charmingly, on which part of the country she happened to be walking through. In much of England, a black cat crossing your path was considered good luck, a small daily blessing. But travel across the sea to Scotland, or in certain other regional traditions within England itself, and the exact same black cat crossing your path in the exact same way was considered a warning of bad luck ahead. There was no single unified British superstition here, just a patchwork of local tradition, layered one on top of another, differing from village to village, much the way local dialects and local recipes differed as well. If she happened to see a spider in the house that morning, she would very likely leave it entirely alone, since killing a spider indoors was widely believed to bring bad luck upon the household, an old rhyme capturing the sentiment neatly. If you wish to live and thrive, let the spider run alive. This belief may have grown in part from the genuinely useful pest control spiders provided in homes without modern insect control, a small piece of practical wisdom quietly dressed up in the more memorable, more persuasive language of superstition and luck. Itching carried its own set of meanings too, a wonderfully specific little corner of folk belief. An itching right palm meant money would soon be coming your way, and was to be rubbed on wood never scratched to help the good fortune along. An itching left palm, by contrast, meant money would soon be going out, an unwanted expense on the horizon. An itching nose suggested you would soon be kissed, or in some regional variations, that you would soon be in an argument, depending, again, on exactly which part of the country and which particular family tradition you happened to have grown up with. New moons carried their own careful etiquette. It was considered good luck to see a new moon for the first time out of doors rather than through a window pane, and considered especially lucky to have a coin in your pocket at that exact moment, which you could then turn over once in your palm, to help ensure prosperity through the coming month. Many Victorians made a genuine habit of stepping outside specifically to greet a new moon properly, rather than risk seeing that first fragile sliver of light through glass, and inviting a month of bad luck instead. And then there was the enormous, almost endless category of everyday charms against what was called simply the evil eye. The old, widespread folk belief that a jealous or malicious look from another person could genuinely cause harm, illness, or misfortune to fall upon you, your family, your livestock, or your home. This belief long predates the Victorian era by many centuries, stretching back through medieval Europe and further still into the ancient Mediterranean world, but it remained very much alive in 19th century Britain, particularly in rural areas, and a whole quiet toolkit of protective charms grew up around it. The small horseshoes, hung with the open ends pointing upward so as not to let the accumulated good luck spill back out, were nailed above doorways in enormous numbers throughout the countryside. Sprigs of rowan, a tree long associated in British folklore with protection against malevolent forces, might be tucked above a door frame or worn discreetly pinned inside clothing. Red thread tied quietly around a wrist or sewn secretly into the hem of a child's clothing was thought to offer similar protection, the color red carrying strong associations with life, blood, and vital force across an enormous range of folk traditions. Let's pause here for a moment and really take in the sheer density of it all. Nearly every single hour of an ordinary Victorian day, from the moment you put on your boots in the morning to the moment you checked the moon that night, carried some small layer of accumulated folk meaning, quietly running underneath the surface of ordinary life like an underground river you couldn't see but could always somehow feel. Most people were probably not consciously thinking about all of this constantly. It had simply become part of the grain of daily life, the same way we today might avoid walking under a ladder ourselves, or feel a small flicker of unease about the number 13, without ever really stopping to examine why. Now, having spent so much of tonight in the world of home and hearth and everyday folk charm, I want to take you somewhere a little different for our final stretch together. I want to take you into the fashionable parlors of late Victorian London, where an extraordinary new craze had taken hold, one that pulled all of these older, quieter folk beliefs about death and spirits and the unseen world, and turned them into something altogether more theatrical, more organized, and in its own strange way, more modern than anything we've discussed so far tonight. The Séance, Parlor, and the rise of Spiritualism. I want you to imagine a fashionable drawing room in London, sometime in the 1870s. The curtains drawn tight against the afternoon light, the gas lamps turned down low, and a small group of respectable, well-dressed people seated around a circular table, their hands joined lightly in a continuous circle, palm to palm. At the head of the table sits a medium, often, though not always, a woman, since Victorian spiritualism offered women one of the very few paths available to them toward genuine public authority, respect, and even income in a world that otherwise offered them extremely limited options. The room has gone completely silent. Somewhere in the shadows beyond the ring of gaslight, the sitters wait, breath held, for some small sign that the world beyond death has consented to answer them. This was spiritualism, and by the middle of the Victorian period it had grown from a small, curious American import into something close to a genuine national phenomenon in Britain, drawing in believers from every level of society, from ordinary working families gathering informally around a kitchen table, all the way up to the highest circles of the aristocracy, and according to persistent historical accounts, even touching Queen Victoria herself, who was widely rumored to have attended séances of her own following the devastating loss of Prince Albert, desperately hoping for some small further contact with the husband she had loved so deeply and mourned so completely. Spiritualism had begun, as these things so often do, with something small and specific. In 1848, two young sisters in America, Kate and Margaret Fox, reported hearing mysterious rapping sounds in their family home, sounds which they claimed came from the spirit of a murdered peddler, and which they said they could communicate with through a simple system of knocks, one rap for yes, two for no. Word of the Fox sisters spread with extraordinary speed, and within just a few years, the practice of gathering in darkened rooms to communicate with the dead through rapping, table tilting, and eventually far more elaborate methods, had crossed the Atlantic and taken firm root in British soil as well. I want you to imagine what a full séance in a respectable London home might actually have looked like moment by moment, because the sheer theatrical detail of it is genuinely remarkable. The room would be darkened, sometimes completely, sometimes with just a single low red lamp permitted, since spirits were widely believed to be sensitive to bright light. The sitters would join hands in an unbroken circle, both for a sense of shared energy and, quite practically, to prevent anyone from secretly assisting the medium through unnoticed movement. The medium herself might begin by falling into what appeared to be a deep trance, her voice sometimes shifting entirely, taking on the supposed personality, accent, and manner of a departed spirit control, a kind of otherworldly guide who assisted in reaching further, more specific spirits beyond. From there, almost anything might happen, depending on the particular medium and the particular fashionable trend of that decade. The simple raps and knocks answering yes or no questions were the earliest and most common form. Table tilting, in which the entire table would apparently lift, tip, and move of its own accord, became hugely popular through the middle of the century. Later, more theatrical mediums developed what was called spirit trumpet communication, in which a lightweight metal cone was said to amplify whispered spirit voices in the darkness, or automatic writing, in which the medium's hand, apparently guided by a spirit rather than her own conscious will, would produce written messages, sometimes in handwriting that startled family members by closely resembling that of a specific departed loved one. And then, toward the very height of the craze, came the extraordinary and deeply strange practice of what was called spirit photography and materialization, in which mediums claimed to be able to physically manifest a visible, sometimes even touchable form of the departed spirit right there in the séance room, often draped in flowing white cloth, dimly lit, moving slowly among the astonished sitters. Photographs from this period, taken during actual séances, survive in genuine numbers, showing shadowy, gauze-draped figures standing beside very real, very solemn-looking Victorian families. We know now, with the benefit of considerable hindsight and no small number of exposed frauds, that most of these materializations were achieved through fairly straightforward physical trickery, hidden assistants, cleverly rigged costumes, and photographic double exposure. But at the time, for a grieving mother or widow sitting in that darkened room, desperately hoping for even a fleeting glimpse of a face they had lost, the emotional power of the experience could be overwhelming, real, and transformative, whatever the mechanics behind it. It's worth pausing here to say plainly that fraud was, in fact, extraordinarily common within the spiritualist movement, and was exposed again and again throughout the Victorian period by increasingly determined skeptics and investigators. Elaborate methods for faking raps, tilting tables through hidden foot pressure, and staging materializations through trapdoors, hidden assistants, and specially treated luminous fabric were documented in exhaustive, sometimes rather entertaining detail by contemporary investigators who made it their particular mission to expose the tricks of the trade. And yet, remarkably, exposure rarely seemed to kill off public belief entirely. New mediums simply rose to replace the disgraced old ones, and the séances continued, packed as full as ever. Why? I think the honest answer brings us right back to where we began this whole evening, in that quiet house with the stopped clocks and the covered mirrors. The Victorian world was one that experienced death constantly, intimately, and often with devastating suddenness, especially the deaths of children. In a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without any of the safety nets we take for granted today, nearly every family carried real, unhealed grief for someone lost too soon. The spiritualism, whatever its very real fakery and theatrical excess, offered something genuinely precious to people carrying that grief. The simple, desperately human hope that death was not truly the end, that some thread of connection might still remain, that somewhere beyond the darkened séance room, the people they had loved and lost were still, in some form, present and perhaps even listening. Even serious, respected scientific minds of the era found themselves drawn into this same hopeful orbit. The physicist and chemist Sir William Crookes conducted lengthy, apparently rigorous investigations into several prominent mediums and came away, to the considerable surprise and consternation of his scientific colleagues, cautiously convinced that at least some of what he had witnessed could not be easily explained away as ordinary trickery. Later in the century, even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the relentlessly logical detective Sherlock Holmes, became a passionate, outspoken believer in spiritualism, following the devastating losses of his own son and brother in the First World War, a conflict that fell just beyond the edge of the Victorian period itself but grew directly without interruption out of this same long 19th century culture of grief, ritual, and desperate hope. Let's sit quietly with that thought for a moment as we bring tonight's story gently toward its close. The man who invented the most famously rational fictional detective in the English language, a character built entirely around cold logic and careful observation, spent the final years of his own life sincerely, earnestly believing that his lost son might still be reachable, somewhere beyond the veil, if only the right medium in the right darkened room could find the way through. The body, illness, and the physician's shadow. Let's go inside once more, this time into a sick room, because illness in the Victorian world was one of the great constant companions of daily life, and it came wrapped almost always in its own thick layer of folk belief, sitting right alongside and often right on top of whatever proper medical treatment happened to be available. I want you to imagine a child running a fever in an upstairs bedroom, the curtains drawn against the daylight, a basin of water and a cloth on the nightstand, and a worried mother sitting close beside the bed. A doctor may have already visited and may visit again before the day is out, but medicine in this period, for all its genuine and rapid progress across the century, still had enormous gaps in it, gaps that folk belief rushed in eagerly to fill. Germ theory itself was not widely accepted until relatively late in the century, following the work of men like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister. And even after it began to take hold among physicians, it filtered down into ordinary households slowly, unevenly, mixed in comfortably alongside older ideas that had been passed down for generations. Bloodletting, the old practice of deliberately draining blood from a patient in the belief that illness arose from an imbalance of bodily fluids or humors, was already declining sharply by the early Victorian period, but it had not disappeared entirely. And you can still find physicians well into the 1850s and even beyond recommending it for certain conditions, alongside the application of leeches, which remained a genuinely common medical tool right through the century. Sold by specialist leech merchants and kept, quite literally, in jars on the shelves of respectable pharmacies. Imagine, for a moment, walking into an ordinary Victorian chemist's shop and seeing a glass jar of live leeches sitting on the counter beside the tonics and tinctures, as unremarkable a sight to the shopkeeper as a jar of boiled sweets would be to us today. Alongside actual, if often misguided, medical treatment, an enormous range of folk remedies and protective charms circulated freely through Victorian households, often handed down, mother to daughter, servant to servant, with no real distinction drawn between what we would now call medicine and what we would now call superstition. A child suffering from whooping cough might be passed, quite literally, underneath the belly of a donkey 3 times, in the belief that this specific act would transfer the illness away from the child. Warts were treated with an almost endless variety of small folk rituals, rubbing them with a piece of raw meat and then burying the meat in the garden, so that as the meat decayed, the wart would fade away along with it, or touching the wart with a pebble for every wart present, then throwing the pebbles away over your shoulder without looking back, effectively throwing the warts away along with them. A particularly widespread and long-lived belief held that the touch of a king, or in later, more accessible tradition, simply the touch of a seventh son of a seventh son, carried genuine healing power, especially for a skin condition called scrofula, which had once been known quite directly as the king's evil, because English and French monarchs had for centuries performed public ceremonies in which they laid hands on afflicted subjects, believing their royal touch alone could cure the disease. This practice had mostly ended by the Georgian period, but the folk memory of it lingered on well into Victorian times, transformed into more accessible local variations, where a seventh son of a seventh son, an unusually rare and therefore unusually potent lineage, was sought out in rural communities for his supposed healing touch, and sometimes traveled considerable distances to treat afflicted neighbors who had heard of his particular gift. Amulets and small protective objects were carried on the body constantly, tucked into pockets, sewn into linings, hung on cords around the neck, largely out of sight but always close at hand. A potato carried in the pocket was widely believed to ward off rheumatism, and there are genuine written accounts of elderly Victorians carrying a single dried, shriveled potato in their coat pocket for years at a stretch, replacing it only when it finally crumbled apart entirely. A small bag of camphor or of asafoetida, a pungent, foul-smelling resin, might be hung around a child's neck specifically to ward off illness during outbreaks of disease, the powerful smell itself thought to actively repel sickness, in a belief that oddly enough carries at least a faint echo of genuine medical logic, since strong-smelling substances were sometimes, in fact, mildly antiseptic. Tithing, an entirely ordinary and universal part of early childhood, was nonetheless treated with real anxiety in the Victorian household, since a teething infant, cranky, feverish, and in real discomfort, was difficult to distinguish from a genuinely seriously ill one in an age before reliable diagnosis. Coral was once again considered specifically protective here, and small coral teething rings, sometimes silver-mounted, were extremely popular gifts for infants, believed both to soothe the physical discomfort of emerging teeth and to ward off the evil eye and general childhood misfortune at the very same time. Two very different kinds of protection bundled together into one small, pretty object. Let's take a slow breath here, and think about what it must have felt like to be a Victorian parent, watching a child suffer through any illness at all, armed with a strange and genuinely inconsistent mixture of real medical knowledge, half-remembered folk tradition, and a whole array of small protective charms, never entirely certain which, if any, of your efforts were actually helping. I think there is something worth sitting with in that uncertainty, something that connects across all this distance of time. However far medicine has come since then, and it has come an extraordinary distance, that particular feeling of doing everything you can for someone you love while still not being entirely sure it will be enough, has probably not changed very much at all. Now let's step out of the sick room and into a very different part of the Victorian house, the servants' quarters below stairs, where an entire separate world of folk belief and daily ritual quietly operated, largely unseen by the family living comfortably above. Below stairs, the servants' own folklore, I want you to imagine the kitchen of a fairly substantial Victorian household. Late at night, well after the family upstairs has gone to bed. The fire has been banked down to a low, steady glow, and the household staff, the cook, the housemaids, perhaps a footman or two, are gathered around the long wooden servants' table, finishing the last of the mending or simply resting their feet before the household stirs again at dawn. Life below stairs operated according to its own careful rhythm, its own hierarchy, and quite distinctly its own thick layer of folk belief, much of it different in flavor from the beliefs held by the family upstairs, closer in spirit to older rural and working-class tradition, carried into the grand houses by servants who had in many cases grown up in small country villages before coming into service as young teenagers. Bread again appears here, but with an added layer specific to the working household. A new loaf was never to be turned upside down on the table, a superstition believed by some to trace back in a roundabout way to the old practice of executioners being given an upside-down loaf as a kind of grim, silent signal on the day of a hanging, so that an upside-down loaf in an ordinary kitchen carried a faint, unwelcome echo of death and misfortune close at hand. A housemaid who accidentally turned a loaf over would often flip it back immediately, sometimes with a small murmured apology, as though the bread itself might take offense. Cleaning, an enormous part of any servant's daily labor in a house lit by coal fires and gas lamps that left soot on every surface, came with its own specific superstitions as well. The sweeping dust directly out through the front door was widely believed to sweep the household's good luck out along with it, and so servants were generally careful to sweep dust toward the back of the house, or at minimum toward a side door, never straight out the main entrance the family themselves used. The sweeping a floor after dark was itself considered unlucky in some households, thought to sweep away money that might otherwise have come to the family, and so evening cleaning, where possible, was quietly rearranged to avoid the act of sweeping specifically after sundown. New employment carried its own small rituals of luck as well. A new servant beginning work in an unfamiliar household would sometimes be advised by more experienced staff to enter the new house for the very first time leading with the right foot rather than the left, a small echo of the same left-right superstition we saw earlier with putting on shoes, but applied here specifically to crossing an important new threshold, in the hope of securing good fortune in the new position from the very first step. There was also, among household staff, a genuine and widely shared body of belief around specific unlucky days for beginning new tasks. Starting a new job or beginning any important new undertaking on a Friday was considered unwise across a great deal of British folk tradition, partly tied to the old association between Friday and the crucifixion. Similarly, cutting your fingernails or your hair on a Friday or on a Sunday was thought by some to invite bad luck, and countless small rhymes existed to help remember exactly which day of the week was suitable for which small personal task. Cut them on Monday, cut them for health, cut them on Tuesday, cut them for wealth, and so on through the week, each day carrying its own small, specific promise or warning. Below stairs gossip and shared folk belief also served a genuinely important social function that is easy to overlook if we focus only on the content of the superstitions themselves. For servants living in close, often quite isolated quarters, frequently far from their own families and home villages, sometimes for years at a stretch, these shared beliefs and rituals created a kind of common language, a shared culture that bound the household staff together, quite separate from the family they served. A new housemaid arriving from Yorkshire might find her particular local superstitions gently corrected or added to by a cook who had grown up in Devon. And over time, in grand households up and down the country, a kind of blended, composite folklore emerged below stairs, drawn from every corner of Britain, richer and more varied in many ways than the more uniform beliefs held by the family living comfortably above them. Let's pause here for just a moment and imagine the sound of that kitchen late at night, low voices, the occasional creak of the old house settling around them, the last of the fire crackling gently in the grate. There is something worth noticing in how much comfort and how much genuine community was built out of these small shared beliefs, whatever their factual truth. In a working life that could be extremely hard, long hours, low wages, very little personal freedom, this quiet, shared folklore offered something valuable, a sense of belonging, and a shared understanding of the world that no one above stairs could take away from them. Now let's step outside the house entirely and follow the Victorian calendar itself through its own thick layer of seasonal superstition, because certain days of the year we'll find carried far more weight and far more careful ritual than any ordinary Tuesday ever could. The turning year, holidays, and seasonal belief. I want you to imagine the last night of October in a small English or Scottish village sometime in the 1860s. The harvest has been brought in, the nights have grown long and cold, and there is a particular quiet unease in the air that everyone in the village seems to sense without anyone quite needing to say it aloud. This was the old feast of Samhain, transformed over centuries of Christian influence into what the Victorians called All Hallows' Eve, or Halloween. And while the enormous, elaborate commercial Halloween we know today did not yet exist, the underlying folk belief that the boundary between the living world and the world of spirits grew thin on this particular night was very much alive, especially in Scotland and parts of the north of England and Ireland. Young unmarried women, in particular, gathered on this night for a whole series of specific divination games meant to reveal the identity of a future husband. Apple peel, cut in one single continuous strip and thrown over the shoulder, was believed to land on the floor in the shape of the first letter of your future spouse's name. The nuts placed in pairs on the hot embers of the fire, one nut named for yourself and one for a particular suitor, were watched closely, since nuts that burned quietly and steadily together suggested a long and happy marriage ahead, while nuts that popped and jumped apart suggested a relationship destined to end badly. Bonfires were lit on hilltops in many rural communities on this night, partly a genuine, practical measure meant to help ward off the cold and mark the changing season, and partly in older folk memory, meant specifically to help ward off wandering spirits believed to be abroad on this one particular night of the year, when the usual boundaries between worlds were at their very thinnest. Christmas, by wonderful contrast, was a season absolutely saturated with its own gentler, warmer superstitions, many of which the Victorians themselves, through figures like Prince Albert and the enormous popularity of Charles Dickens's writing, helped to actively invent, revive, or spread more widely than ever before. The Christmas tree itself, brought into fashionable British homes largely through German influence and the personal example of the royal family, came with its own small rituals attached, and it was considered important that the tree and all its decorations be taken down again well before Twelfth Night, the 12th day after Christmas, since leaving decorations up any later than that was widely believed to invite bad luck into the household for the entire coming year. The mistletoe, an ancient plant already sacred to the pre-Christian Druids of Britain long before the Victorian period, retained deep symbolic weight throughout the 19th century, believed to encourage fertility, protection, and, in its most famous surviving form, a kiss freely given beneath its hanging branches. A tradition held, in fact, that for every kiss exchanged beneath the mistletoe, one single berry ought to be plucked from the sprig, and once every berry had finally been removed, no further kissing beneath that particular sprig was permitted for the remainder of the season. A small built-in limit that must have generated its own quiet flirtatious tension in crowded Victorian parlors. The New Year's Eve carried its own careful ritual, most notably the tradition of first footing, still genuinely practiced in parts of Scotland and northern England today. The very first person to cross the threshold of a house after midnight on New Year's Eve was believed to set the tone, quite literally, for the entire household's fortune through the coming year. Ideally, this first foot should be a dark-haired man, arriving with small symbolic gifts in hand: a piece of coal for warmth, a coin for prosperity, a piece of bread for food, and perhaps a small sprig of evergreen. And it was considered genuinely, seriously unlucky for the first person across the threshold to be fair-haired, or, in the more rigid and rather unfair versions of this tradition, for that first visitor to be a woman at all. Households would sometimes arrange, quite deliberately, for a suitable dark-haired male neighbor to step out through the back door just before midnight specifically, so he could then knock properly at the front door immediately afterward, ensuring the household got exactly the auspicious first foot the tradition demanded. Let's slow down for just a moment and notice the underlying pattern running through all of these seasonal customs. Whether we're talking about apple peel thrown over a shoulder at Halloween, or a dark-haired man carrying coal across a threshold at midnight on New Year's Eve. Every single one of them is really an attempt to take hold of time itself, at exactly the moments when time feels most uncertain. The turning of one season into another, the turning of one year into the next, and to somehow, through careful ritual, nudge that uncertain future ever so slightly toward good fortune rather than bad. Now for our final stretch together tonight, let's follow the Victorians away from the comfort of the hearth entirely, out onto the open water, because sailors, perhaps more than any other working people in the 19th century, lived and worked inside an absolutely dense, unbroken fabric of superstition. One built up over centuries of genuine, mortal danger at sea. The SAILORS, ships, and the superstitions of the sea. I want you to imagine a Victorian sailing ship, somewhere out on the open Atlantic, the deck rising and falling steadily beneath your feet, salt spray stinging your face, the enormous canvas sails cracking overhead in the wind. The life at sea in this period remained extraordinarily dangerous. Storms, disease, shipwreck, and simple accident claiming sailors' lives at a rate that would shock most of us today. And it is precisely this constant, real danger that produced perhaps the richest, most tightly held body of superstition found anywhere in the entire Victorian world. Women aboard ship were widely considered unlucky by sailors throughout this period, a belief with genuinely ancient roots tracing back through centuries of maritime tradition, holding that a woman's presence aboard would distract the crew from their duties, or anger the sea itself, imagined by many sailors in almost personified terms as a jealous and easily offended force. And yet, in a wonderful contradiction that tells you everything you need to know about how superstition actually functions in the real world, a naked woman, specifically carved as a figurehead at the very bow of the ship, was considered enormously lucky, and was believed, according to old sailor tradition, to have the power to calm rough seas simply by baring her breast to the coming storm, since the sea in this same folk logic was thought to be shamed or soothed into stillness by the sight. Nearly every Victorian sailing vessel of any real size carried exactly such a carved figurehead at her bow, and sailors developed real, personal, almost superstitious attachments to these carved wooden women, decorating them, naming them, and genuinely believing that a ship's figurehead carried some portion of her actual luck and character. Certain words were considered so unlucky, they could not be spoken aloud on board a ship under any circumstances. The word for a pig and the word for a rabbit were both widely avoided by sailors across British maritime tradition, replaced instead with careful, roundabout substitute phrases, since both animals were believed, for reasons lost somewhat to time, to bring genuinely serious bad luck if named directly while at sea. Whistling on board a ship was similarly discouraged, except during specific circumstances, since whistling was believed to summon wind, useful perhaps in a dead calm, but genuinely dangerous if performed carelessly during already rough weather, where summoning yet more wind could tip a difficult situation into a catastrophic one. Friday itself was considered a deeply unlucky day to begin any voyage, tracing back once again to that same old association with the crucifixion we saw earlier with the servants below stairs. And this particular superstition ran so deep within the maritime world that shipping companies genuinely, seriously avoided scheduling important departures on a Friday wherever it could reasonably be helped. There is a persistent, much repeated story, though its precise historical accuracy remains debated among maritime historians, that the British Royal Navy once deliberately commissioned a ship named HMS Friday, crewed her specifically with sailors chosen for the voyage, and launched her quite deliberately on a Friday, specifically to demonstrate to a doubting public that the old superstition was mere foolish nonsense. According to the story, as it has been told and retold over many decades, the ship was never heard from again. Whether or not that particular tale is strictly, literally true in every detail, and there is genuine scholarly doubt about it, it captures something wonderfully essential about how sailors' superstition actually worked. It didn't need to be scientifically verified to hold real, genuine power over the men who believed it. In a working life defined by constant, serious risk, where a single bad storm or a single moment's misfortune could mean death for the entire crew, these beliefs offered something sailors desperately needed: a felt sense that the enormous, uncontrollable danger of the open sea could still, in some small way, be managed, respected, and perhaps even appeased through careful attention to the old rules. Tattoos, increasingly common among sailors throughout the Victorian period, also carried real protective meaning well beyond simple decoration. An anchor tattoo indicated a sailor who had crossed the Atlantic. A fully rigged ship indicated one who had rounded treacherous Cape Horn at the tip of South America. And a pig tattooed on one foot, paired with a rooster tattooed on the other, a curious and genuinely widespread combination, was believed to protect specifically against drowning, since pigs and roosters transported in wooden crates aboard ship were noted by sailors to sometimes survive shipwrecks that claimed human lives, the wooden crates apparently floating long enough to wash the animals safely ashore. A small, strange piece of observed maritime fact that hardened over time into a widely held protective superstition carried forever afterward on sailors' own skin. Let's take one last slow breath here, out on that windswept Victorian deck, salt spray in the air, sails cracking steadily overhead, and let's notice one final time the pattern that has run underneath absolutely everything we've explored together tonight. Whether we're talking about a stopped clock in a house of mourning, a piece of coral tucked into a nursery cradle, a dark-haired man carrying coal across a threshold at midnight, or a pig and a rooster tattooed onto a sailor's own weathered skin, every single one of these small, strange rituals grew out of the very same deep, universal human need. The need to feel in a world defined by uncertainty, illness, and sudden loss, that we are not entirely powerless. That there is something, however small, however strange it might look from the safe distance of 150 years, that we can still do. The famous mediums and the men who tried to catch them. Let's go back one more time into that darkened séance parlor, because I promised you earlier that the story of spiritualism was full of specific, remarkable characters. And I don't want to leave tonight without properly introducing you to a few of them. I want you to imagine, first, a small farmhouse in Hydesville in upstate New York in the spring of 1848, because this is really where our whole story of Victorian spiritualism begins. Two sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, aged just 11 and 14, reported strange, unexplained rapping sounds echoing through their family's small wooden house at night. According to the story the sisters themselves told, and told again and again over the following years to enormous paying crowds, the rapping came from the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered in the house some years before, and the sisters developed a simple code. 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, through which they claimed the spirit could answer questions put to it directly. Word of the Fox sisters spread with astonishing speed. Within a matter of months they were giving public demonstrations to paying audiences. Within a few years, their fame had crossed the Atlantic entirely. And by the early 1850s, spiritualism, as a genuine social and religious movement, had taken firm root across Britain as well, spreading from curious drawing room experiments among friends into a much larger, more organized, and increasingly profitable public phenomenon, complete with professional mediums, published spiritualist newspaper, and dedicated spiritualist churches and societies. Decades later, in 1888, both Fox sisters, by then middle-aged women whose lives had been consumed and in many ways damaged by their strange early fame, publicly confessed that the entire original phenomenon had been a fraud, a trick achieved through simply cracking their own toe joints against the floorboards to produce the mysterious rapping sounds. Margaret gave a dramatic public demonstration of the technique before a large New York audience specifically to prove it. And yet, remarkably, even this dramatic confession did very little to slow the wider spiritualist movement, which by that point had grown far beyond the two sisters who had accidentally started it, and had developed its own momentum, its own economy, and its own genuine believers who simply chose not to let the confession change their minds. I want you to imagine next a rather different figure entirely, a young man named Daniel Douglas Home, widely considered in his own lifetime the single most impressive and hardest to debunk medium of the entire Victorian period. Home was known for astonishing feats witnessed by numerous credible observers, tables rising fully into the air during séances, cold, ghostly hands apparently materializing and touching sitters directly, and in his most famous and still genuinely debated demonstration, apparently levitating his own entire body, floating out through an open window on an upper floor of a London house and back in through another window, witnessed, according to contemporary accounts, by several respectable gentlemen present that evening. Home was investigated repeatedly throughout his career, by scientists, by skeptics, by determined fraud hunters, and remarkably, unlike many of his contemporaries, he was never once definitively caught in an act of outright trickery, a fact that continues to genuinely puzzle historians of the movement even today. He performed, by choice, in ordinary lit or dimly lit rooms rather than the total darkness favored by most mediums, which made accusations of simple sleight of hand considerably harder to sustain, and he refused notably to ever accept direct payment for his sittings, instead living comfortably as an invited guest among the wealthy and aristocratic families who hosted him, which lent him an unusual air of credibility his more commercially minded peers often lacked. And I want you to imagine, finally, a young medium named Florence Cook, who rose to considerable fame in London during the 1870s for her apparent ability to fully materialize a spirit named Katie King, who would emerge veiled in white from a curtained cabinet during Cook's séances, walk among the assembled sitters, and even on occasion allow herself to be touched and briefly held. The eminent scientist William Crookes conducted an extended series of investigations into Cook's abilities and came away publicly convinced of their genuineness, a conclusion that scandalized much of the scientific establishment of the day and left Crookes' own reputation somewhat clouded for years afterward. Cook was, on other occasions, caught rather more directly in what looked very much like simple physical trickery, sitters grabbing hold of the supposedly ghostly Katie King only to find, in the ensuing struggle, something that looked remarkably like Florence Cook herself, dressed in white cloth. And yet, even after these exposures, Cook continued practicing as a working medium for years afterward, and continued to find willing, paying sitters eager to believe. Let's sit with these three stories together for a moment: the confessing Fox sisters, the never quite caught Daniel Dungla's home, and the sometimes caught, sometimes celebrated Florence Cook, because together they tell us something important about how belief actually survives contradiction. None of these exposures, however dramatic, however well documented, managed to kill off the wider spiritualist movement itself. New mediums simply rose to take the place of the discredited old ones, and sitters kept coming, night after night, into darkened parlors up and down the country. I think the reason for that persistence is really the same reason we've returned to again and again tonight. People weren't showing up at these séances primarily because they had carefully weighed the evidence and concluded on rational grounds that the phenomena were genuine. They were showing up because they had lost someone, a child, a husband, a parent, a wife, and they were desperately, achingly hopeful that some small thread of connection might remain. That kind of hope, once it takes root in grief, is remarkably resistant to mere facts. A journey across the British Isles. Let's take one final, gentle journey together tonight, out of any single house or ship or séance parlor, and out across the wider landscape of the British Isles itself. Because superstition, as we've touched on once or twice already, was never really one single unified body of belief. It shifted, sometimes quite dramatically, from region to region, county to county, and even village to village, shaped by local history, local landscape, and centuries of local storytelling passed down by the fireside. Imagine, first, the windswept coast of Cornwall in the far southwest of England, a landscape shaped for centuries by tin and copper mining and by the sea itself. Cornish miners carried their own distinct body of underground superstition, centered around small, mischievous spirits called knockers, said to dwell deep within the mine tunnels themselves. These knockers, according to the old belief, could be heard tapping and knocking somewhere deeper in the rock. And this was taken very seriously indeed, since the knocking was believed to indicate the presence of a rich vein of ore nearby, a helpful signal from the spirits of the mine. But it could also, under different circumstances, serve as an urgent warning of imminent danger. A collapse, a flood, a disaster about to strike. Miners were careful never to whistle underground, for fear of offending the knockers, and it was considered good practice to leave a small portion of your pasty, the traditional Cornish miners' meal, as an offering for them, tucked into a dark corner of the tunnel before eating your own share. Now let's travel north and west into Wales, where an entirely different and genuinely chilling death omen held real cultural power throughout the Victorian period. This was the Hearth, a disembodied wailing cry said to be heard shortly before a death, moving invisibly along the very route a funeral procession would soon take, as though grief itself had somehow gotten a head start on the actual event. Closely related was the toily, a phantom silent funeral procession said to be witnessed, sometimes by entire groups of people together, moving along a road well before any actual death had occurred, a kind of eerie preview of grief still to come. Across the water into Ireland, and we find perhaps the most famous of all these regional death omens, the banshee, a spirit woman whose mournful, keening wail was said to foretell an impending death within a particular family, traditionally one of the old, established Irish families with a long lineage. The banshee's cry, according to countless accounts passed down through Irish oral tradition and carried in time by Irish emigrants to England, America, and across the wider world, was described as an unmistakable heart-stopping sound, unlike any ordinary human cry, and to hear it, according to belief, meant that a death within your family was now unavoidably close at hand. Travel further north still, into the Scottish Highlands, and you find the tradition of second sight, a genuine, quite widely respected folk belief that certain individuals, often, though not always, born into particular families with a long reputation for the gift, possessed the ability to see visions of future events, very often visions specifically of death and funerals, sometimes weeks or even months before the actual event occurred. Unlike some of the lighter, more playful superstitions we've explored tonight, second sight was generally treated with real seriousness and even a certain wary respect in Highland communities, and individuals known to possess the gift were regarded with a mixture of genuine awe and, quite understandably, a certain nervous caution, since being told, even indirectly, that you had been seen in a vision of a coming funeral was not exactly comforting news to receive. And in the industrial north of England, in the growing mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, where the older rural superstitions of the countryside collided directly with the new, unfamiliar dangers of industrial factory life, we find a whole new layer of belief growing up specifically around the mills and the machinery themselves. Certain looms were considered unlucky, and mill workers would sometimes genuinely request reassignment away from a specific machine that had previously been involved in an accident or injury, since the bad luck in the belief of many workers could be thought to cling to the machine itself, quite apart from any simple mechanical fault that might have actually caused the original accident. Let's slow down here one final time and take in the full sweep of it, from the Cornish mine shafts to the Highland glens to the thundering mill floors of industrial Lancashire. What strikes me most, looking at this whole patchwork picture together, is how deeply local, how deeply rooted in a specific landscape and a specific working life, so much of this belief actually was. A Cornish tin miner and a Highland shepherd and a Lancashire mill worker were all, in the strictest sense, living under the very same queen, in the very same century, reading many of the very same newspapers. And yet each of them carried forward an entirely distinct body of inherited folk belief, shaped by centuries of local memory, and by the particular, specific dangers of their own particular corner of that shared island. I want you to imagine, one final time tonight, stepping back out of that darkened séance parlor, out past the covered mirrors and the stopped clocks, out of the warm kitchen with its crossed bread and its spilled salt, out past the garden fence where the lone magpie still watches from its perch, and out finally into the quiet, ordinary Victorian street itself, gas lamps hissing softly overhead, the cold night air settling in around you. I think what strikes me most, sitting here with you at the end of this long, quiet story, is how deeply human all of it really was. Every single belief we've walked through together tonight, the stopped clocks, the wedding cake tucked under a pillow, the sixpence hidden in a shoe, the careful ritual of a séance circle, came from the very same place. It came from people trying, in whatever small ways were available to them, to hold onto some sense of control and comfort and hope in a world that was often cold, often uncertain, and often, quite suddenly, heartbreaking. We like to imagine the Victorians as a stiff, buttoned-up, endlessly rational people, marching confidently forward into the modern age of steam and steel and electric light. And in many ways, of course, they were exactly that. But underneath all of it, in the quiet, private corners of ordinary daily life, they were also something else entirely. They were people who covered their mirrors out of love, who tucked coral into a cradle out of hope, who sat in darkened rooms, hands joined, simply wishing with their whole hearts that the people they had lost were not really, truly gone. Maybe that's not so very different from us after all. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with me. If you enjoyed this slow walk through the strange, tender superstitions of the Victorian world, I hope you'll consider subscribing so we can sit together again next time in some other quiet corner of the past. Until then, sleep well and rest easy. Good night.